Hey, I'm Dr. Nate Bosch, Director of the Lilly Center for Lakes and Streams, and with me today I have
Madison, the marketing assistant at the Lilly Center.
All right, and we are going to talk about how do you know if your lake is healthy. So what we have here is we have a Pro DSS. This is made by YSI. I'm holding the sonde here, which has multiple sensors inside of it, and there's a housing here to help protect the sensors, but there's slits all the way around and holes in the bottom to allow water to pass through. So once we put it in the water here, all of these sensors are going to work, measuring lots of different things physically, chemically, and biologically in the lake to give us a sense of the health of the lake. And so we're going to go through those one by one and explain what the number is currently in this lake, which is Winona Lake. We're in Kosciuszko County, Indiana. And we'll talk about what it means and how do we know from that. So we're going to go in those order of physical, chemical, and biological. So Maddie, what's our first measurement we have there?
First is temperature in degrees Celsius. We have 27.1.
All right, 27.1 degrees Celsius. That's our first physical measurement. So that's getting close to body temperature. So we're pretty warm. We usually wouldn't see much warmer than that in one of our lakes in the summertime, but we do see a lot colder than that in the winter months. For example, we'll get all the way down to 0 degrees Celsius where the water would actually freeze on a nice, cold, crisp, calm night. And so temperature-wise, doesn't give us a whole lot of indication of health. That's just going to move with air temperature and with sunlight intensity throughout the seasons of the year. What's our next physical measurement?
Barometric pressure is 743.9 millimeters of mercury.
All right, so barometric pressure, again, this is a good background measurement for context. Millimeters of mercury, this is using an old barometer with mercury in it, moving up and down. It's giving us a sense of different fronts moving through. High pressure, low pressure. It's giving us a sense of what the immediate past and maybe future weather is going to be based on how that barometric pressure fluctuates. But right now, that's a pretty normal measurement that we would see in our lakes.
Next, we have the depth in meters at 0.047.
All right, so another physical measurement is the depth. So what is the water depth in this location? And you said 0.0 something?
47.
Yeah, and so it's really shallow. Obviously, we're holding this just barely under the surface of the water. We could go out to the deepest part of this lake, which would be 80 feet deep, and we've got enough cable here that we could put it all the way to the bottom and see what all these measurements are all the way at the bottom. And that does give us some different ideas of the health of the lake as we look at the top water layer, which is called the epilimnion, and we compare that to the bottom water layer in a lake, that cold, denser water layer, that's called the hypolimnion, and comparing those to each other give us some additional clues as to how clean our lake is. So that gives us some good physical measurements of our lake. Now let's move into some of the chemical measurements.
We have pH, which is 8.48.
Okay, so pH. The pH scale goes from 0 to 14, lower numbers more acidic, higher numbers more basic, 7 is exactly neutral. Rainwater here in Indiana comes down at about 5.6 on the pH scale, so slightly acidic. In our area of Indiana and really throughout the Midwestern United States, we've got a lot of limestone in our bedrock as well as in the glacial till above that bedrock. And so it buffers the water. Even though the water comes down as rainwater, slightly acidic, that pH is going to get buffered higher because of the limestone that we have in our soils and in our rocks. And so that's a good health indicator. Having it be a little bit higher on the pH scale is going to buffer that water from some different pollutants, even some historical things like acid rain that we dealt with more on some of our lakes in the past. What's our next chemical measurement?
Next is salinity, 0.25 parts per thousand.
Okay, so salinity, obviously if we were in the ocean right now or in a coastal marsh sort of a situation, we would see that salinity much higher. I think 32 parts per thousand if I remember correctly. Here we're less than 1, very low salinity levels. Even with road salt being used on our roads in the wintertime here in the Midwest, still that number is not going to get to a level, at least not that I've seen in our lakes, where it's going to start to be an unhealthy factor in our lakes. Having that nice and low in a freshwater lake is healthy and just what we would expect. Maddie, what's our next chemical measurement?
Next, we have specific conductivity at 0.519.
All right, and that's in millisiemens per centimeter. That gives us a sense of what the salts are generally in the water, and that's a number that we would expect in our lakes. Somewhere in the 0.5, 0.4 sort of ranges. We're not seeing such high salt levels from pollution, road salt, those sorts of things that is raising it to harmful levels to the critters that live in our lakes and streams, but yet it's not down near zero either. So we do have some salts in the water. What's our next one?
Next is dissolved oxygen, 12.88 milligrams per liter.
All right, dissolved oxygen. If we were only to take one measurement in our lake to get a sense of what the health of the lake is, that's the one that I would pick. Right now it's at 12, which is fairly high. And so that tells us that there's lots of oxygen both getting into the water from the air above, diffusing down under the water surface, but there's also oxygen being produced under the water. What might be producing oxygen? Well, we have aquatic macrophytes, also known as weeds, and we have algae, also known as phytoplankton, that are down in the water doing photosynthesis, producing oxygen, and that's raising the oxygen level. And that's a good thing because we need oxygen for zooplankton, which eat our phytoplankton, the little fish and the big fish in our lakes, our planktivores and piscivores. They all are going to breathe oxygen out of the water.
Last is dissolved oxygen percent at 162.
Okay, so it's over 100%. That tells us that it's super saturated right now. And you might ask, how can it be over 100% oxygen? Well, that tells us that right now actively there's lots of oxygen being produced by algae or phytoplankton living down in the water. It's giving the water this sort of greenish hue to it. It's a little bit cloudy, not super clear, not quite to an algal bloom stage, but certainly high level of oxygen because there's high level of algae right now in this water. Algae is doing photosynthesis, producing oxygen. That's why we have a super saturated situation right now. And that's a negative indicator for the health of this particular lake currently. Now let's move into the biology since we've been talking about that.
Now we've got chlorophyll A, 2.54.
All right, so chlorophyll A, that's a pigment that makes plants look green. So that pigment reflects light off grass, leaves, algae, and makes it look green to our eyes. And so that's a general sense of how much algae is in the water. And the units that we have in this particular meter, RFUs, so that would be relative fluorescent unit, kind of a generic unit. Relative is right in the name. And so we would look for that number to go up and down, but any particular value of that number is not so meaningful. But as it goes higher, we know there's more algae in the water, indicating less health in the lake at that particular time. And then what was our last one?
Last one is phycocyanin at 0.48.
All right, phycocyanin is another pigment that's found in algae, but unlike the chlorophyll, which is in all types of algae, phycocyanin is just in our blue-green algae, also known as cyanobacteria. That blue-green algae we pay particular close attention to because it can produce toxins which can be harmful to people and their pets. And so again, that number is in those same RFUs, that relative fluorescence unit, not terribly biologically useful as a number by itself, but more relative as we see it go up and down throughout the day and throughout the year. We can get a sense of how those algae levels are moving up and moving down. At the Lilly Center, we take water samples and bring algae samples actually into the laboratory to very specifically identify different species of algae in our lakes, as well as the quantity of those algae in our particular lakes. Hey, you might be wondering about, okay, that's great, and that's a lot of numbers for that lake, Winona Lake, where you all are. What about my lake? I'm glad you asked. If you go to our website, lakes.grace.edu, you'll find a lakes directory there. You can dial into your lake. We've got over 100 lakes included there, and you can see the most recent data for your lake specifically, and you can get some analysis there as well as to what that tells you about the health of your lake. Every fall we come out with a new Beneath the Surface publication which compares a lot of these measurements that we've just been talking about from one lake to another and from one year to another, and you can get a sense of how your lake compares to others over time and by location.